Picture this. You're standing in the golden halls of Nero's palace in ancient Rome, 67 AD, watching shadows dance across marble walls. At the center of the grand chamber, Emperor Nero sits on his throne, his arm wrapped around a stunning woman dressed in silk robes and glittering jewels. She moves with grace, her beauty catching every eye in the room. The court watches in awe, yet something feels wrong. Servants exchange nervous glances, guards shift uncomfortably. The very air seems heavy with a secret too dark to speak aloud. Because the woman beside Nero was once a young man named Sporus, surgically transformed against his will to replace the emperor's dead wife. This is one of the most twisted acts of power and cruelty in human history. This is the story of a madman's obsession that destroyed an innocent life. This is the tale of a young person who lost everything, even their own identity, to satisfy an emperor's sick desires. This story will crawl under your skin and stay there, haunting your thoughts long after you hear the final, heartbreaking truth. When absolute power meets twisted love, innocence becomes the ultimate victim. Today, we dive into a story that shows how far a madman will go when he believes he can remake reality itself, and the terrible price paid by those caught in his web. This isn't just ancient history. This is a warning about what happens when power has no limits, and when one person's pain becomes another's pleasure. To understand this nightmare, we need to go back to where it all began, with a young emperor who thought he was a god. Nero became ruler of Rome in 54 AD, when he was just 16 years old. From the very beginning, he was different from other emperors. While most rulers focused on war and politics, Nero dreamed of being an artist. He wanted to sing, act, and perform for crowds. But Nero had a dark side that grew stronger each year. He killed his own mother when he was 21. He murdered his first wife. He burned parts of Rome just to build his golden palace. The people whispered that their emperor had lost his mind. Then, in 62 AD, something happened that would change everything. Nero fell deeply in love with a woman named Poppaea Sabina. She was beautiful, smart, and ambitious. More importantly, she was the first person who truly understood Nero's artistic soul. Nero divorced his current wife and married Poppaea in a grand ceremony. For 3 years they were inseparable. Poppaea became pregnant twice. The first child died young. The second pregnancy seemed to be going well, but in 65 AD, disaster struck. During an argument, Nero lost his temper and kicked Poppaea in the stomach. She was heavily pregnant at the time. Within hours, both Poppaea and her unborn child were dead. Nero's grief was unlike anything Rome had ever seen. He wept for days. He refused to eat. He wandered the palace calling Poppaea's name. The most powerful man in the world had become a broken shell. The court physicians tried to help, but Nero's madness was growing deeper. He ordered Poppaea's body to be preserved with expensive spices and perfumes. He built shrines to her memory. He even declared her a goddess. But none of it brought her back. And that's when Nero's obsession took a terrifying turn. 2 years after Poppaea's death, Nero was traveling through Greece when fate delivered him a cruel gift. In a small town, he saw a young man who made his heart stop. The boy's name was Sporus. He was probably around 13 or 14 years old, with delicate features and large, innocent eyes. But what caught Nero's attention wasn't just Sporus's youth or beauty. Sporus looked exactly like Poppaea. The resemblance was so striking that Nero's guards thought they were seeing a ghost. The same bone structure, the same graceful movements, even the same way of tilting his head when curious. In that moment, something snapped in Nero's already damaged mind. He stared at this innocent boy and saw his dead wife. He saw a chance to undo the tragedy that haunted his dreams. He saw a way to bring Poppaea back from the dead. Nero's advisors watched in horror as their emperor became obsessed with this young stranger. They begged him to reconsider whatever he was planning. Even his most loyal supporters could see that something terrible was about to happen. "Find another wife," they pleaded. "Choose from the noble families of Rome. Pick someone who can give you legitimate heirs." But Nero wasn't listening to reason anymore. In his twisted mind, fate had delivered exactly what he needed. Why should he settle for another woman when he could have Poppaea herself? The boy's family tried to flee, but you don't run from an emperor. Nero's soldiers brought Sporus to the palace, and the young man's nightmare began. Sporus had no idea what was coming. How could anyone imagine what Nero had planned? Nero summoned the most skilled physicians in the Roman Empire to his palace. These were men who had studied in Egypt and Greece, masters of surgical arts that wouldn't be seen again for centuries. "I want you to perform a surgery," Nero told them. "I want you to transform this boy into a woman." The physicians were shocked. Such operations had been attempted before, but they were dangerous, painful, and often fatal. More importantly, they were completely against the boy's will. But arguing with Nero meant death. So, with trembling hands, they agreed to perform one of history's most horrific surgeries. Sporus screamed and begged, but no one could save him. The boy who had been living a simple life just days before was about to lose everything that made him who he was. The surgery took place in secret, deep in the palace dungeons where screams couldn't be heard. While Sporus fought for his life in the palace medical chambers, whispers spread through Rome like wildfire. Servants talked in hushed voices. Guards shared rumors with their families. Even senators began to worry about their emperor's mental state. The story of what Nero had done reached every corner of the empire. In taverns and marketplaces, people spoke of an innocent boy who had been destroyed to feed an emperor's madness. Some Romans were disgusted, others were terrified, but many simply accepted it as another sign that their emperor had become a monster. The transformation took months. Sporus nearly died several times. The pain was unimaginable, but the emotional trauma was even worse. This young person was watching their entire identity being erased, piece by piece. Nero visited daily, bringing gifts and speaking softly about Poppaea. In his twisted mind, he was helping his lost love return to him. He couldn't see the terror in Sporus's eyes or understand the magnitude of what he had done. When the physical transformation was complete, Nero's true madness revealed itself. He dressed Sporus in Poppaea's clothes, her jewelry, even her perfume. He had servants style Sporus's hair exactly like his dead wife's. Then came the moment that shocked even Rome's jaded aristocracy. Nero announced his marriage to Sporus. The wedding was a grand affair, held in the same hall where Nero had married Poppaea years before. Sporus walked down the aisle in a white silk gown, surrounded by flowers and music. To the watching crowd, it looked like a fairy tale. But those who looked closely could see the truth. Sporus's eyes were empty, like those of a person whose soul had been torn away. This wasn't a bride walking toward happiness, this was a victim being paraded for an emperor's entertainment. Nero treated Sporus exactly like a wife. He gave gifts of gold and precious stones. He wrote love poems. He demanded affection and companionship. In public, they appeared as a devoted couple. Behind palace walls, the reality was far different. Sporus was a prisoner in silk and jewels, forced to pretend to be someone else every single day. Every morning meant putting on Poppaea's face. Every evening meant enduring Nero's twisted version of love. The young person who had once been free was now trapped in a nightmare that never ended. Sporus couldn't even grieve for their lost identity. Nero demanded constant smiles and gratitude. Months passed this way. Nero paraded his wife through the streets of Rome, showing off what he believed was his greatest triumph over death itself. The crowds cheered, but many whispered prayers for the young soul trapped in this living hell. For a brief moment, it seemed like Nero's plan might actually work. Sporus had learned to play the role perfectly, moving and speaking just like Poppaea. The emperor was happier than he had been since his wife's death. But happiness built on such cruelty couldn't last. Cracks began to show in Nero's fantasy world. Sometimes, when Nero wasn't watching, Sporus would stare into mirrors with a look of complete despair. Palace servants reported hearing quiet sobbing from the imperial chambers late at night. More troubling for Nero, the illusion wasn't perfect. No matter how much Sporus looked like Poppaea, they weren't her. The conversations weren't the same. The laughter wasn't genuine. The love Nero craved was impossible because it was based on a lie. The emperor's frustration began to grow, and with it, his cruelty toward the person he claimed to love. As 68 AD dawned, Nero's empire was falling apart. His brutal reign had finally pushed Rome too far. Rebellions erupted across the provinces. The Roman Senate declared him an enemy of the people. Even his own guards began to abandon him. But instead of focusing on saving his throne, Nero became more obsessed with Sporus than ever. As the real world crumbled around him, he retreated deeper into his fantasy of resurrected love. He began making impossible demands. Sporus had to be Poppaea in every way, her thoughts, her dreams, even her memories. When Sporus couldn't remember details from Poppeia's life, Nero flew into violent rages. The young person who had already sacrificed everything was being pushed to new levels of impossible performance. There was no way to succeed because Nero was demanding the impossible, that a living person become someone else entirely. Palace staff watched in horror as their emperor's final descent into madness played out. Some tried to help Sporus in small ways, a kind word, an extra blanket, a moment of privacy. But mostly, everyone was too terrified to intervene. The city of Rome itself began to turn against Nero's cruel obsession. Graffiti appeared on walls calling for Sporus's freedom. Anonymous letters flooded the palace, begging the emperor to end this nightmare. But Nero was beyond hearing anyone's pleas. In his mind, the entire world existed only to support his twisted version of love. In June of 68 AD, the end came swiftly. Roman armies were marching on the capital. The Senate had sentenced Nero to death. His own guards had fled. The most powerful man in the world was about to become a hunted fugitive. Faced with capture and execution, Nero made his final, selfish choice. Rather than face judgment for his crimes, he decided to take his own life. But even in his last moments, his thoughts weren't of the people he had hurt or the empire he had destroyed. Instead, he looked at Sporus with tears in his eyes and whispered, "My beloved Poppaea, we'll be together again soon." Those words revealed the complete depth of his madness. Even facing death, Nero couldn't see Sporus as a real person. To the very end, this young victim was nothing more than a prop in the emperor's sick fantasy. When Nero died, Sporus was left alone in a world that had no place for someone like them. The other members of Nero's court were arrested or fled. The palaces were looted. The empire moved on to new leadership. But Sporus remained trapped in a body and identity that weren't their own, with nowhere to go and no way to reclaim their stolen life. The new emperor, Galba, kept Sporus as part of his household, but not out of kindness. Like Nero, he saw Sporus as a curiosity, a living reminder of the previous regime's madness. For months, Sporus wandered the halls of power as a ghost of someone else's making. The young person who had once had dreams and hopes was now nothing more than a historical footnote, forever trapped by what others had done to them. Ancient historians tell us that Sporus lived in constant fear and sadness during this time. There was no going back to who they had been before. The surgery, the trauma, and years of forced performance had stolen away any chance of a normal life. Some nights, palace guards reported, Sporus would stand on balconies overlooking the city, staring into the darkness for hours. What they were thinking about, no one could know. But anyone who saw them could feel the weight of their suffering. This was the price of Nero's obsession, a young life destroyed not for any crime, but simply for resembling someone the emperor had lost. When Galba was murdered and replaced by Emperor Otho, Sporus faced a terrifying prospect. Otho had been Poppeia's first husband, the man Nero had stolen her from years earlier. The cruel irony was impossible to miss. Here was the original victim of Nero's obsession, now with power over the person who had been turned into Poppeia's replacement. But instead of revenge, Otho offered something unexpected, a choice. For the first time since this nightmare began, someone asked Sporus what they wanted to do with their own life. The answer was both heartbreaking and inevitable. Sporus chose death. After years of being forced to live as someone else, after enduring unimaginable trauma and loss, this young person decided that freedom could only come through ending their suffering. The historical records don't give us details about Sporus's final moments, but they do tell us that their death was seen as a tragedy throughout Rome, the final, inevitable conclusion to Nero's monstrous obsession. Some historians suggest that Sporus's choice was brave, a final act of defiance against those who had stolen their identity. Others see it as the only escape from a life that had become unbearable. What we know for certain is that Sporus died young, far from the simple life they had been living before an emperor's madness destroyed everything they were. Their death marked the end of one of history's most twisted tales of power and obsession, but their story didn't end there. Today, nearly 2,000 years later, we remember Sporus not as Nero's creation, but as a victim whose suffering reminds us of the terrible cost of unchecked power. In those golden halls where this nightmare began, shadows still dance across marble walls. But now they carry a different message, a warning about what happens when love becomes obsession, when power destroys innocence, and when one person's pain becomes another's twisted pleasure. This is the story that history tried to forget. This is the tragedy that power tried to hide. This is why we must never forget the name Sporus and never let such cruelty happen again.